So we're going to look at this key concept of globalisation, discussed a lot in the last few decades. How do we define globalisation? Well, really globalisation is like the world economy being more like a single economy, more like one economy, as if the world was to an extent economically one country. It really refers to increased interconnectivity, or more connections throughout the world. But in economic terms, we really look at certain key aspects will be free movement of goods and services, or increasingly free movement of goods and services, increasing trade, for example, without tariff barriers, the increasing movement of capital flows, increasing financialization. That's when the finance sector is a larger part of a country's GDP, that's financialization, and also globally finance is much more interconnected, which has been the case in the last few decades. Also, of course, there's the freer movement of intellectual property, technology, and particularly a characteristic of globalisation is the growth of multinational corporations, sometimes known as TNCs, transnational corporations. These organisations, I suppose, like Coca-Cola, Apple, Ford, McDonald's, often American and often controversial. And these global brands and global multinational companies are a key aspect of globalisation. So let's look at what has caused this to happen. Well, of course, one of the biggest influences policy changes. So in the 40s and 50s, the trade became increasingly free, and the World Trade Organization has been established, which promotes the liberalisation of free trade. Also the dominance of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And they're really part of what might be called a neoliberal consensus, pro-market, pro-small government, pro-privatisation. And they would, for example, argue for the removal of capital controls, which was done by Britain in 1979 and by most other countries in the world, which means capital can flow in and out of countries dependent on market forces and not controlled by the government. We also have huge change in communication, such as the World Wide Web, of course, the 747, now maybe the Dreamliner by Boeing, meaning people can move around the world very relatively cheaply, relatively easily, and produce can move around the world by air freight, for example. Now, a key aspect of this is to enable an increase in trade is containerization, and huge ships that benefit from economies of scale, which means that shipping costs are relatively low, at least forgetting about the environmental costs. So let's have a look. How does globalization affect consumers? Well, certainly consumers tend to benefit from lower prices due to lower costs, often due to more competition worldwide. So globalization is a bit like the gains from trade. If there's more competition, then that will tend to reduce monopoly power and push prices down. Also, it gives consumers more choice in terms of the goods and services they consume. So typically in Britain, people buy lovely cashmere jumpers like this relatively cheaply, and of course they tend to be made in the Far East in relatively low wage economies. So increased choice. Now, if we look at the other side of this, how does it affect producers? Well, producers, if they can produce and sell on a worldwide basis, such as a multinational company, they can gain significant economies of scale. Many different types of economies of scale, such as production economies. So that will tend to lower production costs as they increase their sales and increase their market. So if you potentially have a worldwide market, then that is huge compared to one country, and therefore you can produce on a larger scale, produce more efficiently, and therefore there's lower costs and potentially larger profits. So also you benefit from lower cost of inputs. If you can source your raw materials worldwide, or you can have a greater choice of suppliers for your inputs, then again that will lower your input costs. So outsourcing is something that many multinational companies do. That's when they move production to low-cost centres. Dyson vacuum cleaners in Britain would be an example, moving out of Britain. Marks and Spencer's, of course, no longer sources clothes from within the UK, but from outside the UK. However, these longer supply chains, often crisscrossing borders many times, makes producers vulnerable to sudden changes and economic shocks. Also, the increased competition from large producers, such as MNCs, can adversely affect small and medium-sized enterprises. So, for example, a small local cafe could be easily put out of business by Starbucks, which is a huge global brand, of course. Also, footloose capitalism is a problem where if production moves from one country to another, of course, there's a loss of jobs in one particular country, and it will affect local suppliers as well. Okay, so that's the key thing about producers. And if we now turn to workers and individuals, how does globalization affect workers? And here we can see really a huge divide between different groups. So rich countries have a different experience to emerging markets. Developed countries, advanced economies, compared to developing countries or poor countries, have different experiences. And these are the experiences. In rich countries, you tend to have a loss of manufacturing jobs. Sometimes we call that deindustrialization. Whereas in emerging markets, such as China, we tend to have industrialization, where workers increase employment in the industrial manufacturing sector and a reduction of employment in agriculture. So people move from rural areas to urban areas. Labour moves from employment in the agricultural sector to increasing employment in the manufacturing sector. And this tends to mean that wages go up. So for example, instead of working in the countryside growing rice, you might make a few pence of rice a day. You know, you'd be lucky to make $0.25, say. Whereas if you made lovely trainers like these are actually Swiss trainers, but I dare say they're made in the Far East. They're just Swiss designed, so they can charge more for them, I suppose. Anyhow, these trainers, if you make trainers, then your value added is much higher, isn't it? And therefore wages will be higher, so you'll be better off. So in emerging markets, there's a good news story, was that the development of a large middle class whose incomes have increased. So those are the educated middle class, such as lawyers or maybe financiers. And also the key aspect of globalization, which is the good news, is a huge fall in absolute poverty. This is people, according to the United Nations, depending what measure you use, who earn less than $1 a day or less than $125 a day. Many estimates put this at about 1 billion. 1 billion people have come out of absolute poverty. Many of these people, of course, in China, based at one point on export-led growth. The corollary of this is that some people, of course, argue, and some economists argue, that this labour is exploited because wages are lower in China than they would be in Britain. But they're beginning to increase, and one change is that the differences between many countries, but not all countries, are beginning to narrow. That inequality is narrowing between certain countries that are emerging markets, such as China, and countries like Britain. However, the problem is that in Britain and rich countries, it can lead to structural unemployment. It can lead to a loss of manufacturing jobs, and it can also lead to stagnant incomes. So Stiglitz, the great Nobel Prize winning US economist, would point out that 90% of US incomes have been have been stagnant in real terms since really the late 80s because of a loss of jobs in these sectors and their replacement really with low-skilled, particularly low-skilled service sector jobs that are often more precarious, like cleaning, for example, or indeed working in Starbucks. There's been a stagnation in wages of those that are unskilled and semi-skilled. Now, the other key thing to point out is that profits have increased as a proportion of GDP. So multinational companies have been able to squeeze more profit from their revenue whilst holding wages down as a proportion of GDP. This is pointed out by Thomas Piketty, and some argue that to some extent that is a crisis in capitalism. Of course, it can be addressed by things such as a minimum wage and increasing the minimum wage, which has happened in the UK, so that George Osborne calls it, slightly cheekily, the national living wage. Anyhow, these wages could increase with legislation, and that could compensate to some extent and mitigate this problem in advanced economies. And it's certainly good for the top 1%. So the top 1% that tend to own capital, their wages for many have gone off into the stratosphere, huge increases. And hence a certain amount of political tension about globalisation, and indeed people protesting being anti-globalisation and anti-free trade, okay, which the WTO helped to bring about. So trade, what happens is really trade tends to equalise wages in the world, because if you trade, if we ignore the transport costs, then it means that multinational companies can locate production in relatively low wage economies, and these will therefore, when you shift production, that will push down the wages in the richer countries. The wages will come up in the poor economies until they're more equal. Yeah. The things that stop this is the technological advancement of countries like Britain and the United States, and also, of course, that there is a cost to transport. Okay. Also, it's not just globalisation that's sort of led to this. The key aspect is technological change. For example, introducing robots in car factories. So Britain has never produced more cars, but with fewer people, so that's high labour productivity because of technological impact, because of automisation using robots. So Stiglitz and many Keynesian economists would argue that the solution to this is to manage globalisation more effectively by redistributing income, by putting in policies of social protection, such as, I suppose, trade union rights, but a higher living wage, redistributive taxation. And he would argue that a country like Sweden is an open economy, takes part fully in globalisation, adopts new technology, and but everyone more or less benefits. It's globalisation for the many and not the few, at least as far as advanced countries are concerned. And then finally, we have the environmental aspect. So many aspects of globalisation and an increase in trade have led to resource depletion, climate change, of course, by the production of greenhouse gases such as CO2, air and water pollution, deforestation in countries like Brazil, for example, and extractive industries resulting in the pillage of the environment and significant environmental damage, for example, in many poor countries. So foreign direct investment is often a part of this. Of course, this can be mitigated by worldwide agreements, such as those in Kyoto, in Paris, and we can see a success in terms of the problem with ozone depletion, where the world has really agreed to limit the use of gases that have a harmful effect on the ozone layer, CFCs, I think. Yeah. Anyhow, the overall conclusion would be that globalisation is potentially a force for good and certainly has reduced absolute poverty for many, but perhaps it needs better management in terms of redistribution. So thank you very much for watching.